Hi, this is Pia from UFO Denmark. On behalf of our group, UFO Denmark, I'd like to welcome this week Preston Dennett. He's an author and a researcher, and today he's going to be speaking about the healing power of UFOs. So thank you for joining us, Preston. Looking forward to hearing what you have to tell us.
Hey, thanks, Pia. Yeah, I'm honored and delighted to speak with you guys, and have got a nice presentation, which I think you'll enjoy for sure.
Thank you. We're looking forward to it. So when you're ready.
All right, yeah, I'm ready. Let me just start a little bit by introducing myself and how I got involved in UFO research. I grew up very skeptical of this subject, but in 1986, I heard a report on the news about a pilot over Alaska who had seen a UFO. The newscasters just kind of joked about it and moved on. Later found out there was radar returns, multiple witnesses, and this UFO followed this plane for many miles. It's a great case, and it got me interested enough to start asking my family, my friends, and the people I worked with what they thought about, UFOs, and found out that a lot of them, 25% maybe, had really profound encounters. My brother chased a UFO down the street with his two friends. My sister-in-law saw a UFO with two of her friends over Van Nuys Air Force Base here in California. And someone at work said that she was followed by a UFO. She had missing time. Another lady at work described these objects that she watched with her family. I had another friend who had missing time. So this really hit home for me. And I started checking out all the books, joining UFO organizations, and investigating this firsthand, and have never looked back. This is the first article I actually wrote about UFOs, and it was about sightings in my hometown where I lived back in 1988 or so. And this cataloged a wave of sightings over the area. I became a field investigator for MUFON, joined all the other groups I could find, and began interviewing people and researching the subject firsthand. Over the years, I've written a number of books. These are all the books I've had published on UFOs. I've written a number of other books on the paranormal as well. So I have been researching the subject for, 30 some years now. And my first book was actually called UFO Healings. This was published back in 1996, and it covered 100 cases of people who had experienced a healing as a result of a UFO encounter. And by UFO healing, I mean someone who experiences a physiological improvement of some kind due to an interaction with a UFO. And these healings range from flesh wounds, cuts, bruises, burns, things like this, broken bones, to healings of minor illnesses such as colds and flus, stomach aches, fevers, infections, to very serious illnesses such as diabetes, tuberculosis, arthritis, and of course many cases involving cancer. I initially found 100 cases, and after writing this book, got a huge reaction. I've been contacted by many, many other people over the years and have collected now many more cases. This is an article that was published on the cover of the UFO MUFON Journal, and it covers several of the early cases. This is Virginia Aronson. She's a researcher who wrote a follow-up book to UFO Healings called Celestial Healings. There's also another book by Peter Michaels. So the UFO Healing book was really the first book ever to look into this phenomena of UFO healings. Here's Adrian DeVere. He wrote another book called Healing Entities and Aliens. So the book really sort of broke open this field of UFO healings, and for the first time, people started to discuss it seriously. Tonight, I really want to talk about some of my favorite cases and some of the more important cases of people who have been healed by aliens. I do think we're dealing with aliens. I think that's the theory which best fits the evidence. And I think some of the healing cases actually provide some of the best evidence we have of ET contact. This is Gordon Creighton. He's an early English researcher, and he wrote the very first article ever published on UFO healings back in the 1950s, and it was called Healings from UFOs, and he outlined about 10 cases. So he was the real true pioneer of UFO healings. And while there's not a lot of researchers talking about these cases, what I found is that almost every major researcher out there has uncovered cases like these. Here's Bud Hopkins. He admitted that yes, these cases do happen, but they're very rare. David Jacobs said the same thing. He's uncovered several healing cases, people who were healed of pneumonia, of diphtheria, and things like this, but said it was very rare. John Mack uncovered several cases. He's the author of Abduction, and he thought that no, these cases are probably a little more common than most people believe. Edith Fiore, she was the first person with a PhD to write a book on abductions, and she said that fully half of the people she's worked with have had healings. So it's not known exactly how common these cases are, but most major researchers have uncovered cases like them. Barbara Lamb, a Southern California UFO researcher, has uncovered cases of people healed of all kinds of things: back injuries, heart problems, cancer, and other problems. Brad Steiger has been a researcher for many years, has uncovered about a dozen healing cases. Yvonne Smith, she got a case of a man who was healed of AIDS. So my point is, these cases are not as uncommon as I think even people within the UFO community believe. This is Wendell Stevens, a very well-known researcher who has also uncovered several healing cases. Richard and Lee Boylan, their book, Close Encounters, Benevolent Encounters with ETs, was one of the first to really look at the UFO phenomena in a sort of a positive light, that maybe aliens aren't, our enemies or here to take over our planet, but are here to help us in some way. So first I want to talk a little bit about why I think aliens make good doctors. And what you find in onboard UFO experiences, the most common thing that people experience is being physically examined. Thomas Bullard did a study of 270 onboard cases and found that that was the thing which most people described. And certainly that's been true in my research and in other people's research. So what we're seeing is a very strong medical theme that's running through onboard accounts. In fact, many people describe the UFOs as being like a hospital. People term the ETs doctors, and they describe these physical examinations very much in the way that people describe going to a doctor's office. So the ETs are very interested in the human body and know a lot about it. And in fact, I think they probably know more than we do. One of the ways they do heal people is through the use of light beams of light. This is a very strong theme that runs throughout most of the UFO healing cases. The UFO entities seem to know a lot more about the electromagnetic spectrum than we do, certainly, because these beams of light can levitate people. They can render solid objects permeable, like walking through a wall. They can paralyze people. They can also heal people. Another way aliens heal people is by giving them medicine. This is probably the rarest way they heal people. Probably maybe 10% of the cases involve pills or lotions or liquids that people drink. There are a lot of cases involving medical evidence, and medical evidence can literally make or break a case. The most common thing that I think people experience medically wise is a scar of some sort. These are all scars right here on abductees' bodies, which seem to be as the result of ETs medically injecting people or operating on them in some fashion. Often people will report implants. This is an implant from a man I wrote a book with, the Coronado Island UFO incident. And he was apparently implanted. He had an MRI which shows these foreign bodies here in his brain and actually in other areas of his bodies. There's been a lot of talk about implants and what their purpose may be, but I do know of at least 4 cases, and 2 of these are people I've interviewed, where people were told the purpose of their implant was, in one case, to boost the body's immune system. In another, it was to measure the level of pollution. In another, it was to sort of monitor a person's vital signs. So the point is that I'm trying to make is that there might be a very benevolent, positive reason for these ET implants. This is Mona Stafford, Elaine Thomas, and Louise Smith, who experienced a terrifying abduction in 1976 in Kentucky. All 3 of them not only had missing time, they suffered burns on their neck, headaches, scars, and eye irritation. Under hypnosis, they all recalled a pretty harrowing abduction, which they would never really have researched if not for the medical symptoms. So there are a lot of cases involving medical evidence. The MUFON Investigative Journal has a section on physiological effects. It doesn't mention healings at all. It only mentions injuries, which isn't really fair, because while there are more injury cases than healings, there are a lot of healing cases, and they deserve to be recognized. This is a slide from Timothy Good's research. Denise Bishop was struck by a beam of light from a UFO in 1981, and it ended up causing a laser burn on her hand. So these are the kind of symptoms that can't be faked. Here's Stephen Michalik, who got too close to a UFO when it took off, and he ended up having very severe symptoms, including nausea, fever, weight loss, and his blood level dropped to a very alarming rate, to the point where he was examined by numerous doctors who pretty much concluded that he was suffering from some form of radiation sickness. And there are a few cases of human mutilations as well. That's very rare, and I think so statistically rare as to be almost insignificant. But there is a dark side to some UFO encounters, and I certainly don't want to gloss over the fact that people have suffered medically as a result of a UFO encounter. I could have easily written a book about that subject, but I think that since this subject has been sort of relegated to the fringe, and a lot of people aren't talking about it, and it shows a positive aspect to UFOs, I decided to focus on cases where people have been healed. And UFO healings fall into 4 major categories. People are visited in their home by ETs who administer a cure right there in their bedroom in most cases. Another good portion, probably about half of the cases, involve people who are actually taken on board a craft and examined inside a UFO where they're given an operation. A number of cases take place while people are just driving or walking outside and a UFO hovers overhead. It might send down a beam of light. Not always, just sometimes being in the mere presence of a UFO is enough to cause a cure to happen. And this really surprised me. About 10% of the cases occur in hospitals. And I know how that sounds, but as any UFO researcher will tell you, UFO encounters can happen anywhere. ETs can appear in crowded areas where you'd least expect them. I've interviewed people who've had experiences in hotels, in crowded condominiums, on a train, on a subway, in places you'd least expect it, on the freeways. And 10% of the cases of people who have been healed, they are visited in their hospital room. This right here is the Cowichan Hospital up in Canada, where a nurse saw this UFO hovering right outside the hospital. And she described it very clearly. She could see entities inside. And here's the actual hospital hovering right there in front of that top row of windows there. So what this is showing is that ETs have a very strong interest in healing people in a wide variety of ways. So let's just start to get right into the cases. One of my favorite cases is actually pretty well known within the UFO literature, and it was one of the first cases to be revealed. And it occurred when two police officers, this is back in like 1954, I believe it was. Two police officers, Deputy McCoy and Deputy Good, were driving, and this is in Damon, Texas, when they came upon this large UFO. As you can see here, it was hovering next to them over a field and was sending down this purple beam of light. And as it's shining down this light, this beam of light came towards their car and hit them. Well, one of the officers, Deputy Good, had been bitten by his son's baby pet alligator and had a wound on his finger, which was, painful and swollen. It was all bandaged up. And Deputy Good had his arm hanging out the window. And this beam of light struck it, and he could feel it on his arm. He said it had heat and tingling, and they were pretty frightened. They drove off and pulled over in a diner some miles away. And that's when they found out that his finger no longer hurt. He pulled off his bandage, and the wound was gone. So there are a lot of cases of some people who are cured of flesh wounds. Here's another well-known case from researcher Jacques Vallée, which took place in France. A medical doctor, actually woke up one evening seeing flashes of light that were coming from his son's bedroom, and he looks out the window and sees these UFOs, which come together into one object, turn on its side, and it flashes a beam of light, which hits him. He stumbles into his room and falls asleep, and wakes up the next morning to find something really remarkable. He had earlier slashed his foot with an axe while cutting wood. And now the wound was, pretty painful, and it was going to take a while to heal. But when he woke up that morning, the wound was completely gone. And not only that, years earlier, he had been paralyzed from injuries he sustained during the Algerian War. He was partially paralyzed on one side of his body. After being struck by this beam of light, he wasn't. And he was actually able to return to playing piano professionally, which he had to give up. Yeah, I'd like to talk a little bit more about healings of flesh wounds. There are a lot of cases like these, dozens. One I'd really like to talk about is from a gentleman who I call John. I interviewed him. He's from Belgium, actually. He's a young man, very intelligent, very into sports, football, soccer, skiing, these sort of things. He does have a history of UFO encounters. Most people who are being healed do seem to have a UFO history in their family or themselves, but about 1/3 do not. So it's hard to say who's being healed and why, but the most common thing that points towards the possibility of UFO healing is having a lot of UFO encounters in your life. This gentleman did have a previous event involving missing time when he went out into his backyard, saw a UFO, and came back in, and it was about an hour or so later. Later in life, he was working and started to notice he had this terrible foot pain, and his foot was swelling up. He went to the doctor, and they weren't able to diagnose it. They tried doing various treatments. Nothing seemed to work. It just got worse and worse. It got to the point where he couldn't walk, he couldn't put on his shoes, and was starting to have to use crutches. It looked like he was going to be in a wheelchair. He was trying even laser therapy, and that didn't work. It just got worse. He went to the local park and just prayed to God and prayed to whoever was listening that he could get help. And it was that night he had a visitation by ETs, apparently. He had 3 beings come into his room. He couldn't really see them. He was sort of in a semi-awake state. And one of them he calls the doctor. The other 2 he says were guards. And the doctor grabs his foot and starts twisting it very painfully in all these different directions in ways he certainly couldn't move it without intense pain. And he thought maybe he was being attacked or assaulted by somebody and is trying to wake up but couldn't. When finally he wakes up and it's morning and he's thinking there's an intruder in the house, so he runs downstairs to check all the doors and the locks. And that's when, he was halfway down the stairs when he realized he was running, and looks down and his foot is normal, and he kind of smiles, and he realized at that point what had happened, that he had been healed. So he takes a very benevolent viewpoint towards these ETs. This is Jerry Wills. He's what you would term a contactee as opposed to an abductee, in that he had friendly visitations by human-looking ETs while a child in Kentucky. I interviewed him as well, and he described this encounter where he had a terrible fever and was not getting better when he had a visitation by gray-type aliens who took him aboard a UFO and gave him a couple of injections and cured him of his fever. Here's another very interesting case, Charles Moody. He was a sergeant in the Army when he had an abduction experience. Here's the ETs as he drew them, where he described being taken on board, examined, taken to the engine room, and given various messages. While being taken by these ETs, he struggled and actually hurt his back. And the ETs used this kind of cylindrical instrument to heal his back pain. It's interesting because I've heard several people describe the exact same instrument that he's describing. Another lady I interviewed, I'll call her Natalie. She's from Norway. She had there's like 15 cases of people who've healed of back pain. And Natalie was an art director at the time, and she injured her back pretty bad and was unable to work. And following the injury, she was in her room one night when these gray type ETs walked in and surrounded her bed. She was very scared. She had no interest or history of UFO encounters, and wasn't exactly sure what was happening to her. And these figures kind of tossed her around like a rag doll, she says, put her on her stomach and pressed this instrument up against her back, which sent pulses of energy. And they were there for just maybe a minute and then filed out through the wall. And she jumps out of bed and can see this sort of blue light out the window. And the blue light turns off, and the experience was over. And her back pain was instantly healed. This is Richard Rilke. He's a contactee from New Jersey. Many people claim to have not only been healed once, but several times. He was healed of a crushed finger, a result of an equipment injury. While he was in the hospital room waiting to be treated, ETs appeared and shined an instrument over his finger, healing it. He also claims to have been healed of an ear infection, and at one point he had a large tumor on his face, which had been viewed by everyone he knew, over 100 people, and the ETs healed that. And that impressed a lot of people that his case was real, because it was the sort of thing that just couldn't be faked. There's healings of all different types of things. There are dental healings, alien dentists. I know how that sounds, but there's a good half dozen cases of people who've had their teeth healed. One occurred to a gentleman named Daniel in West Virginia. He was having experiences when he was on board one time, being taken on board a UFO, and he asked the aliens to heal his impacted wisdom tooth. He wasn't able to treat it because he didn't have the money, and the ETs did that. They put this instrument in his mouth and actually healed his wisdom tooth. Another case, this is Leonard Stringfield, a researcher from Ohio, and he had a case where a young boy by the name of Chuck Doyle from Florence, Kentucky, was suffering from a head cold. And this UFO hovered over his backyard, and Chuck was struck by this beam of light from this UFO, which froze him still, paralyzed for just a second. He saw these weird lights, landscapes, equations, a lot of stuff he couldn't quite understand. The beam of light retracted, and Chuck ran inside, told his mom, and I believe she saw the UFO moving away. At any rate, he was cured of his head cold instantly. There's a good dozen cases of people who are cured of colds. Now, why ETs would, fly light years or wherever they come from to cure someone of a cold, I don't know. But there's a lot of cases like it. Timothy Green Beckley has uncovered a number of UFO healing cases. He talks about the case of Brandon Blackman, a columnist from New York, who had a gash on his finger. Brandon Blackman was in Van Cortlandt Park in New York City with a bunch of people when a UFO showed up and just hovered around them. And he wasn't struck by a beam of light. He wasn't taken on board. But following this encounter, when he got home, he took the bandage off his hand and there was no sign of the cut he had received earlier that day. So there are a lot of cases like that. One gentleman was on his way to the hospital to be treated for kidney stones. He was in a lot of pain when this UFO appeared and started circling around his car, and the pain went away, and when he got to the hospital, the kidney stones were gone. There are about 5 or 10 cases of people who are healed of kidney stones as well. There's a number of cases, 15 or 20, of people who received eye cures. One gentleman had his eyeball apparently removed and put back by the ETs. That cured him of color blindness. There's a very famous case which took place in Peru involving a customs official who was out on his balcony when this UFO, which was some ways up there, struck him with a beam of light, and it cured him of nearsightedness. He no longer needed glasses to see. And not only that, it cured him of rheumatism. So in some cases, people are cured of multiple conditions at one time. This is Howard Menger. He's a contactee from the 50s whose story is very controversial, and yet he's able to present more or better evidence than a lot of abductees, including taking his friends to see UFOs and at least one healing. He was in Okinawa when he was blinded as a result of a shell explosion. His eyes became infected, and he was visited in his hospital room, apparently, the hospital tent, by ETs. There are a number of cases like that. There was one guy, who were healed of war wounds. Another guy was also healed of eye injuries as a result of shrapnel hitting his eye. There was another soldier, a Russian soldier in Afghanistan, who was torn apart by a grenade, and he was pulled on board a UFO, and the ETs cured him as best as they could, but they ended up having to amputate his leg. They told him they weren't able to save his leg, but they were able to heal, amputate his leg and heal the wound. And Army officials found this soldier on the field with his already healed amputated leg, and it caused all kinds of controversy. They weren't able to understand how he had become a soldier in the Army with one leg. This is Anna Jamerson and Beth Collings from Virginia, who wrote a book about their encounters. They both experienced improvement in their eyesight as a result of their UFO encounters. And in fact, that's how one of them realized she was even having encounters, is suddenly her eyesight improved dramatically for no apparent reason. Alan Godfrey is a police officer from England. He was suffering from infertility. He had suffered an accident earlier while on the job as a police officer, and later had an encounter with a UFO, which he draws here. He didn't realize it at the time, but he had had missing time. Following this encounter, he was ridiculed mercilessly. His superiors asked him to resign because of all the attention he was receiving from his UFO encounter. He refused, and they ended up taking away his police car and giving him a bicycle. And he ended up resigning just because everything he loved about being a police officer had been destroyed, pretty much as a result of the ridicule from this UFO encounter. But following this incident, his wife became pregnant, and he at first accused her of cheating, and she denied it. And they went to the doctor and found out, yeah, she was in fact pregnant, and apparently this gentleman had been cured as a result of a UFO encounter of his infertility. And again, it's one of many cases. This is Carl Higdon, a hunter from Wyoming, who had a UFO encounter, and it was a typical encounter. He was taken on board. He saw animals in cages. He was physically examined. He was apparently taken to another planet. That's a very long, involved encounter. But upon his return, he discovered 2 healings. He was cured of his kidney stones, and he was also cured of tubercular scars on his lungs. He had had tuberculosis, which scarred up his lungs. And following this encounter, his lungs were brand new. Jim Sparks, he's written a very interesting book about his encounters, which he remembers mostly in full consciousness. Many people have to be hypnotically regressed to recall missing time. He remembers his encounters often as they happen. He had a couple of very interesting encounters. One encounter, the ETs came into his living room where he was suffering from the flu and basically cured him with a little instrument, a handheld instrument that sent beams of light onto him and cured him of the flu. On another instance, they took him on board and they showed him all this black goo in these little containers and handed it to him. And they said, "This is our gift to you." And he took the containers and he smelled it. It was disgusting, smelled really bad. And he's like, "What is this? You know, why are you giving this to me?" And they said, "This is our gift to you. We removed it from your lungs." So at the time, Jim Sparks was a heavy smoker of cigarettes, and the ETs basically cleaned out his lungs and showed him getting really sick if he didn't stop smoking. There's another case exactly like that where a gentleman was given black goo and told that they had removed it from his lungs. And in that case, the ETs told the gentleman to stop smoking. At the time, he was smoking marijuana. And they said, you have to stop smoking. This is not the life that we had planned for you, is what they told him. There's a number of cases where ETs do dispense medical advice. One lady, she was having severe kidney problems and had total kidney failure. She rushed to the doctor, and the doctor's like, "Oh my God, you have to go to the emergency room right now. You need dialysis." She was unable to urinate. She was in an enormous amount of pain. Instead of going to the emergency room, she went home and called her family, her friends, her coworkers, her boss, everyone she knew, and asked them to pray for her. There are about 10% of the cases where people have prayed for healing and got one. And usually they're praying to angels or God or something, as this lady was. And instead, ETs show up. She did not describe the grays. She described these little sort of midget-like creatures, dark skin and stout bodies, large eyes, and they sort of held her there on her bed and massaged her abdominal area for a good hour or more. At one point, she blacked out. And in the morning, she was feeling much better. She was able to urinate after 3 days of not being able to. She went to her doctor, who was astounded and said, "Well, I must have misdiagnosed you." In many of these cases, the doctors can hardly believe what they're seeing and become very upset, as this doctor was. Well, this lady had a follow-up visit by the ETs about a month later, where she was actually taken on board, and the ETs were displaying her organs on this sort of living X-ray. I've heard this many times. It's sort of a holographic image of the inside of a person's body in live time, in living color. And she saw her liver, or her kidney rather, and the ETs are saying, "Well, your kidneys look much better now." And then they showed her her liver, which had all this darkness on it, this black stuff. And they're like, "Your liver is not doing well. And what you need to do is to stop drinking Diet Coke, because look what it's doing to your liver." So they actually are dispensing medical advice in a number of cases. This is a drawing. Most of the drawings you see here are by my sister-in-law, Kisara, who has worked closely with me to sort of accurately portray UFO encounters. And this is Alicia Hansen, a lady I interviewed who's received multiple cures. She's had visitations all her life by gray-type ETs who she said were incredibly loving, very emotional, and very spiritual. And they taught her to do all kinds of things aboard the UFO, including hands-on healing and things like this. She had an encounter as an adult where she went suffering from a cyst in her her fallopian tubes. And it was causing her a lot of pain, a lot of problems. And it was diagnosed on X-ray and MRIs. and she was going to have it removed. And shortly before the operation, she had a visitation. This is something I found in a number of cases. Like on the way to the hospital, or the night before people have an operation, or maybe a week before, or even right at the hospital itself, the ETs will intervene and cure the person but right before the operation. And this happened to her. She went to the doctor. The doctors did some MRIs, as they always do, right before they do the operation, and could not find the cyst. They were very upset because she had laser scars on her stomach, and there was fluid in her fallopian tube, which is only present if someone has had surgery. So they accused her of having surgery, which she completely denied. And they said, well, we know you did because the cyst is gone, and there's this fluid here. And she did not tell them, that she had had a visitation by ETs because she was afraid. So it left, both of the doctors and herself pretty upset. There's another case just like this from Bill Hamilton involving a Southern California abductee who had a cyst in her breast. It was shortly before she was going to have it removed, where she had an encounter in her bedroom, went to the doctor, and lo and behold, the cyst was gone. Again, we have before and after x-rays proving this incident, so it's great evidence. This is Sisto Paz Wells, a Peruvian contactee who takes people out in groups and shows them UFOs, and has done so successfully for many years. He did this up in Sebago Cabins, New York. And when he did this, one of the gentlemen there, who was a professional dancer, was struck by this beam of light. And that night, he was apparently visited, as were several people in their cabins. And in the morning, he woke up, his pajama bottoms were removed. He had not taken them off, but he had been suffering from arthritis, or some arthritis-like condition of his legs. And that was completely cured. His legs were no longer swollen, no longer painful, and he could walk normally. Billy Meyer, who's a very well-known contactee, a very controversial case, which I do believe is valid, simply because it's got so much evidence, landing trace cases, some 200 witnesses, and at least 2 healing cases. He was healed of pneumonia as a child, and he was once taken in full view of his friends, and he was healed of the flu. And in another case, he was healed of rib injuries sustained in a motorcycle accident. This is a drawing by my sister-in-law of Linda, a lady who suffered a liver condition. As a child, she had fallen and damaged her liver, and she was taken regularly aboard a UFO and treated for it. She was also cured of cancer. She was suffering from breast cancer, and the ETs cured her of that. Here's the ETs she saw, and here's one of the instruments that she was used to be healed by. Her sister was also cured, Sherry. Both of them were cured of a number of conditions, including yeast infections as well. A very famous case is that of Ventura Maceres, who was cured of, this is a case in Argentina. He was struck by a beam of light from a UFO, saw entities, and following his being struck by a beam of light, he started to grow a bunch of new teeth in his mouth. It's an extraordinary case, and was well verified, as he was actually interviewed by over 40 different professionals, including UFO researchers, government professionals, military officers, and several doctors as well, of course. Here's a case of Fred White from Durham, England. He was suffering from a hole in his heart, and it was very painful. He was having a lot of trouble breathing and was scheduled for an operation when this gentleman showed up into his hospital room, and he immediately noticed the gentleman was dressed strange. He looked very exotic. He had this strange sort of instrument on his wrist, which clearly wasn't a watch. It was glowing. And the gentleman expressed interest in Fred White's research in electronics. He was an electronics inventor and a specialist. And apparently the ET wanted him to continue his work in that area and healed him of his heart condition. Later on, I mean, it was very quick, just a minute long maybe. The gentleman walks out, the doctors come in shortly later, and Fred's like, who was that doctor who just came in and healed me? And they're like, what doctor? They ran a whole bunch of new tests. The hole in his heart was gone. They couldn't explain it. But this case is important, I think, because it shows who is being healed and why. I've noticed in a number of cases, the people who are being healed are people who are doing good work for humanity in some way. They're entertainers, they're doctors, they're teachers, they're inventors, they're social workers. The lady from Norway who was cured of a back injury, she's a human rights activist and animal rights activist. So this is the type of people, it's a loose pattern, not super strong, but definitely see it, that these are the types of people who are being healed, which I think shows a real positive side to the alien agenda and why they're here. They're trying to enlighten humanity, I think, to some extent. Here's another perfect example of that. This is Jim Sparks, who is an award-winning human rights activist and social worker who fought against racism for many years. And he had a missing time encounter with his son in Wisconsin. And it was a typical encounter with gray-type ETs. It first involved missing time, but over the next few weeks, they remembered what happened. They remembered being taken on board and given injections. And following this incident, Jonathan Salter noticed 20 different physiological improvements. He grew a couple of more inches. His feet grew a couple of sizes. He started growing 5 o'clock shadow at twice the rate he had been. He stopped smoking. His fingernails grew much faster. His cuts healed at twice the speed they had been. Scars that he had had for years disappeared. Pains and aches he had been having, back pain and things, also disappeared. He lost weight. His skin tone improved. He had what I call an upgrade. This is something that a lot of people have reported. They're not necessarily sick of a particular illness, but are instead physiologically improved in a number of areas. He says he hasn't gotten sick for years and years. He just passed away last year, I believe, in quite an elderly age. There's another case involving a gentleman by the name of Ted from Southern California. He suffered from angioma. Angioma is a very serious condition involving a malformation of the blood vessels in the brain, can cause paralysis, loss of speech, blindness, and can be fatal. He was taken on board and cured of angioma. He says the ETs actually sawed off the top of his head and used lasers to shrink the blood vessels in his brain. And here's sort of the instrument that was used and a diagram of how this operation took place. And following this cure, his condition improved dramatically. At the time he was suffering from angioma, he had lost the ability to speak and could not eat or walk by himself. And following this incident, he returned back to normal health. This is one of the humanoids he's seen aboard ETs. All different kinds of humanoids have been seen. These cases take place all over the world. The top producers are the United States, Russia, England, Canada, and Puerto Rico. This is a case from Russia involving a young boy who was cured of a liver infection. There was a bunch of cases in one particular area, Tbilisi, involving people who've been cured. And the cures are so numerous there that people are apparently, hoping to be cured of a UFO, hoping to see a UFO. One case involves a lady, Katerina, who was struck by lightning, and it was causing her problems with her heart. And immediately she was taken on board a craft, and these ETs started operating on her heart, and she believes cured her of heart problems. There's a family from Oregon, the Twiggs family, who have all had encounters, and each of them have been cured at one time or another. The son was cured of a sty in his eye. The daughter was cured of asthma. The mother was cured of a cesarean scar and also colitis in her intestines. And the father was cured of back pain. This is Joy Davies from Pennsylvania. In 2012, she was suffering from arthritis, which was so severe she had to give up her tennis playing. And then she had an encounter while hiking behind her home where there's a big forest. And she came upon this landed UFO and was taken aboard by very friendly ETs. She said she wasn't afraid at all. It was just a very brief encounter. She doesn't remember all of it. But afterwards, she was let out and the UFO just took off and she walked home. And it was the next morning when she realized that her arthritis was gone. And she was able to take up professional or was able to play tennis again. And her dog was with her during this encounter. And her dog also became, she said, more lively and seemed to have an improvement in his health. By the way, I did include a chapter on people or animals who have been healed because I uncovered about 7 cases, 5 cases involving dogs, 1 case involving a horse, and 1 case involving roosters during a rooster fight. So yeah, even animals have been healed. This is Cynthia Hind, who's best known for doing research in Africa. And she uncovered a couple of cases. One involves a South African mother and daughter who were taken aboard a UFO, and both were cured. The mother was cured of jaundice, which was a pretty serious condition. This is Michael Shareed Carter. He's a social worker who received an award from President Clinton due to his fights against racism. He was suffering from a blood clot while living in North Carolina, in Asheville, North Carolina. He was diagnosed with a blood clot. His leg swelled up to twice its normal size. The doctor was very concerned and put him on this very strong medicine to sort of blood thinners and to take care of this blood clot. But it would take at least a couple of months for him to get back to normal, when suddenly in the middle of the night, he was visited by ETs. Now, he had had a previous encounters with gray-type aliens where he was abducted and examined and things like this. On this occasion, he saw human-looking ETs, very beautiful-looking man wearing a robe, very muscular, long blonde hair, a very kind expression on his face. This was in his bedroom at night. The being holds up his hand and sends out a beam of light, which hits Michael right in the head and chest. And this is one of about 10% of the cases where the healing is not done by instruments, but by mind power or hands-on healing or in some psychic capacity, because there was no instrument. He was just struck by this beam of light, which came directly from the being's hand. It dazed him and he passed out. And when he woke up the next morning, his blood clot was gone. His leg was now normal size. And not only that, all the arteries in his leg had been apparently rerouted. So all kinds of illnesses have been healed. This is João Valerio and his son. He was from Argentina, I believe, or Brazil, and had regular encounters with UFOs. Well, where he worked as a hospital doorman, and at the hospital there was this kid who had suffered from a cerebral aneurysm, which had left him paralyzed. And the people at the hospital asked João Valerio if he could get medicine from the aliens. João agreed to ask, and he asked these ETs if they would provide medicine to help this boy who had suffered from a cerebral aneurysm, a stroke. And they said yes, and provided this medicine right here, which the doctors applied like a lotion directly to the child's body, to his spine and his head, and it apparently cured his paralysis and reversed the condition that is supposedly chronic, irreversible. So the ETs are able to cure all kinds of chronic conditions. And what's interesting about this case is doctors were able to preserve a specimen of the medicine, which was sent for chemical analysis. And the chemical analysis came back, and what it showed was that the material was chemically unique. They were not able to identify it or what it was really at all. There are a number of cases where people are cured of very serious diseases, such as One gentleman was cured of AIDS. That was in France. There's another gentleman who was cured of diphtheria up in Wisconsin. He actually reported seeing somebody who was cured of muscular dystrophy as well. One gentleman, the earliest case I could find was of 1921 or so. And this gentleman was taken on board a craft and cured of tuberculosis, which at that time was a very big problem. And he did not really understand what had happened to him until years later, when drawings and images of gray type ETs were coming out in the media in the 1950s and 60s, and he realized, oh my gosh, that's what happened to me back in the 1920s. All right, yeah, there are about 40 cases of people who've been healed of cancer, all different kinds of cancer. And one really interesting case occurred in Florida to City Councilwoman Lynn Plaskett, who had been diagnosed with Hodgkin's lymphoma and was suffering very badly from it. While she was at home, she was lying in bed one evening when this thing came in through the window, and it was like this glowing ball of light, but it looked like it was actually metallic, some sort of like a miniature UFO kind of. And she felt her body rise up off the bed, and this object started circling around her and sending this powerful beam of light onto her. And after just a few moments, she was lowered back onto her bed, and this object exited her room. And she felt really good about it. She felt like this was a healing encounter. And sure enough, following that incident, her cancer cleared up very quickly. And I could go on and on with the cancer cases. I'll just mention one other, which is also a very interesting case. Helena Charbonneau from Canada had been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. The doctors did their best to remove it, but weren't able to remove it all. And as a result, her cancer spread throughout her body to her kidneys, her liver, her stomach. And at some point, she started to get much sicker, and doctors told her she had about a month to live. And got so sick, her skin had turned really an orange color. She was barely able to walk, and doctors expected she would die shortly. And that's when she had this very powerful impulse to get into her car and drive out of town, which she did. And she was barely able to do it. She was so weak. Drove out of town and came upon this landed UFO, and she was pulled on board, and they gave her a very painful operation. Many of the cancer cases involve onboard experiences with painful operations, and that's certainly what she described. She said that they used all kinds of instruments, opened up her body, sucked out all this sort of black material, and closed her up and used various lights and instruments and told her, do not take any of the medicine that the doctors give you, and you'll recover within 3 days. And they put her back in her car, and she returned home, and she told her son, she woke up the next morning and told her son what happened. Her son did not believe her, and so they drove back to the location where she had seen this object, and sure enough, there was a big mark on the ground where the UFO had landed. And following this incident, she became very sick. She was rushed to the hospital, and doctors said, this is it. She is going to die now. And her family came, and she didn't die. She held on for the next 3 days. She was very sick. The doctors tried to give her medicine. She refused. She said, just water, give me water, which is what the ETs told her to do. And she started to get better. And very slowly she got better, and she lived for many more years completely cancer-free. One other cancer case comes from Canada as well. Jim Schaefer was suffering from a cancerous tumor on his neck. I've seen photographs of it. He showed me his doctor records, and he was having a lot of encounters and was filming these orbs which would come into his house. And he always had his camera ready and would carry it around just in case one of these orbs appeared. And that's exactly what happened. This orb appeared. He was able to not only capture it on film, he captured it on video. And this orb appears, and it comes zooming towards him and actually goes into his chest. This is a snapshot of that video, of that orb. And he went to sleep that night, and when he woke up the next morning, the tumor on his neck was gone. He had walked into the bathroom and it was gone. He was scheduled for an operation about a week when this happened, about a week later, and went to the doctors, and they were completely astounded. He did tell his doctors what happened, and has, because he has often returned from his encounters with injuries and cuts and scars and puncture wounds. So they knew his history. And when he came to them and showed that he had no longer had a tumor, they had no choice but to believe him, because there's no way you can fake something like this. They continued to do the operation anyway because there was necrotic tissue that needed to be removed. But they verified that in fact his cancer was cured. And as far as I know, Jim Schaefer's the only guy who's ever been able to photograph the UFO or the orb that cured him. So those are the healing cases in a nutshell. That's a fair sampling of them. But I did want to mention that there's other types of miraculous healings. This is a photo of Mary Clamser. It turns out during a thunderstorm in 1994, she was struck by lightning, and this cured her of multiple sclerosis. I did some research onto this, and it turns out that there are over 100 cases of people who have been cured of a wide variety of conditions as a result of a lightning strike. Dr. Panos Papis of Greece did a whole study on this and did remarkable research showing cases stretching back some 200 years to the present day. In addition to being healed by ETs, a number of people are helped in a wide variety of ways. This is an illustration of a lady by the name of Sherry who suffered a motorcycle accident, which caused, she was fine, but her motorcycle was damaged to the point where the Kickstarter couldn't be worked. At that point, the only way to start a motorcycle was to use a Kickstarter, and it was bent out of shape. And she was stranded there in a very remote area in the mountains in the middle of the night. This is in New Jersey. And she was wondering what she was going to do when these gray type ETs appeared, lifted up her motorcycle and fixed it. And I know how that sounds, but there's a lot of cases of people who have been helped in various ways. There was one lady, or a gentleman, I'm sorry, who's driving along and sees this UFO, and it sends down a beam of light ahead of him and on the highway, and he sees that there is a mattress there, and he would have hit it and had a very severe car accident if these ETs hadn't showed up. There's another case from R.D. Six Killer Clark, really interesting researcher who's done amazing work with indigenous peoples. She describes an encounter in South America, or in Mexico, on the Yucatan Peninsula, where this object hovered over a small Mayan village and protected it from heavy hurricane force winds. So there's a lot of cases like this where people are helped in ways that you'd least expect. There's 2 cases of people who were healed or saved from drowning. One guy was falling in quicksand and he was pulled out by short reptilian-like creatures. Another lady from France was drowning in a river and she was pulled from the river by ETs. There was one lady who was about to be assaulted by a gentleman when a UFO showed up and scared this criminal away from her. She was sure she was about to be assaulted and raped. And the UFO saved her. There's another case where this UFO hovered over a boat that was about to sink in a very severe storm, and the rescuers were unable to find the boat and saw this UFO very brightly, and it pinpointed the boat and allowed them to effect a rescue only hours before this boat actually sank. So again, this is showing a very positive side to ETs. Another thing I found is that many people who have encounters come away from their encounters with the ability to heal. By that I mean like Reiki or hands-on healing. The lady I interviewed who was healed of a cyst in her breast or her fallopian tubes also had a car accident where she was healed of flesh wounds. Well, she was able to do hands-on healing and actually was able to show me. By grabbing my feet, she pulsed energy through my body, and I could actually feel this energy very strongly pulsing through my body. So a number of these people are very effective healers. This is the Integratron. This is a building in Southern California in the desert, which was designed and built by George Van Tassel, a contactee. And he says ETs told him how to build this building and that it would rejuvenate people and allow them to live much longer. Unfortunately, George Van Tassel died before the building could be completed. But it's one of many examples where ETs are apparently expressing an agenda to heal people. This is Whitley Strieber. He's very well known and says that he gets letters and emails constantly from people requesting them to be healed. And I can say the same as well. I get emails pretty regularly, once a month, I would say, from people either reporting a healing or requesting information or asking me to put them in touch with ETs to heal them. I wish I could. Most of the healings seem to be on the ET's agenda, not ours. And it's done on a very limited basis. I'm guessing there are a lot more cases than the 300 I've documented in my book, simply because most people don't report their cases or don't know who to report them to. There is some evidence that our government and other governments have possession of ET healing technology. There are many reports of crashed UFOs that have been recovered, such as the Roswell incident, which is only one of probably several hundred, if not closer to 1,000 or more. And there are some whistleblowers who have come out and said that, yes, we have recovered some of these healing instruments and are using them on a limited basis and testing them on people. There's a handheld instrument that can open a person's body and close it up with a laser, very much like you see on Star Trek. There's another instrument described by a whistleblower. He says it's like a glowing red jewel, and it slides over a person's body and can detect any tumor in their body, where it is, and project an image of it. So that apparently, yes, we are using these instruments to some extent, but they're not in the public arena. And I think the ETs know better than to just hand us this technology, because more likely than not, it would fall into the wrong hands, such as the military, who would abuse it and use it to, say, heal soldiers and just send them out back into the battlefield, or would cause huge problems with overpopulation and things like this. I do think we're going to see disclosure, which is also, there are too many whistleblowers out there, too many people who say that our government has crashed UFOs and ET technology for this to be covered up much longer. At some point, our governments are going to come clean, and everyone will know that UFOs are real. And I think when that happens, we're going to see open official contact with ETs, which seems to be one of their agendas. When someone's taken on board a UFO, and the main thing that happens is they're physically examined. But beyond that, they're given messages. And those fall into three main categories. One is warnings of environmentalism, nuclear proliferation, overpopulation, pollution, global warming, this sort of thing. ETs seem to be very concerned about our planet. Another is people are taken into the engine room and shown how UFOs work. Basically shown that ETs operate their UFOs on electromagnetism and magnetics. And in some cases, people are actually given instructions on how to build their own energy-free motors. So that seems to be another very strong agenda on the part of the ETs, is to move us away from fossil fuels. And thirdly, and this I see very much, is people are given messages about healing, about how to do hands-on healing, or how to become healers themselves. People come away from their experiences, they're spiritually transformed, they become channelers, they give psychic readings, they become Reiki masters. By and large, they are vegetarians. It's something I see very often as people get very interested in alternative methods of psychic powers and dowsing and all these sort of things. This is a subject I take very seriously. I think once we get this ET technology released, we can solve the energy crisis, the economic crisis, and the environmental crisis all at once. There's no reason for poverty to exist, or disease, really. And we have the potential to move into a new age if we would just concentrate our energies on these sort of areas instead of on, wars and greed and things like this. So I'm very hopeful about the future of humanity. Even though we are going through a difficult time right now, I think we're on the cusp of great changes. And a lot of it depends, I think, on the UFOs and the ETs and how this all rolls out in terms of disclosure and open official contact. But what I can say is, in closing, the top 10 causes of death as listed by the United States and the world, are heart disease, cancer, strokes, respiratory disease. In the United States, suicide is the 10th leading cause of death. I can say that after documenting 300 cases of healings, that ETs have cured people of all the top 10 leading causes of death in the United States and the world. So they are definitely very interested in healing people. I think it's one of their primary agendas. One couple of cases I'd like to close with. There's one from Florida. Jim Law was suffering from an ulcer when ETs showed up, and he had had a lot of previous encounters and had gotten to the point where he could converse with these ETs. And he says, if you're going to abduct me again, I want you to cure this ulcer I have. And they said, okay, or rather it's a hernia, I'm sorry. And they said, okay, we know of this condition you have and we will cure it. And they did. And during this time, he asked them, why are you contacting me? What is it about me that's so different? And the ET said, well, we are interested in your genetic potential to live a long time, which Jim found very interesting because at the time he was writing a book about his grandfather, who was 106 years old and still, very active. So again, this shows a very positive agenda of the ETs. There's another case, which I believe occurred in Denmark, which I thought you guys might be interested in, to Hans Lauritsen. He's a UFO researcher, and he claims to have gone out on a UFO stakeout with his friends and fellow researchers and was struck by a beam of light from a UFO. And at the time, he was suffering from liver hepatitis, and his liver was swollen to almost twice its normal size. Following this incident, he went to the doctor, and his liver was now back to normal size, a fact which was confirmed by his doctor. So there are a lot of very well-confirmed cases of healings. And I think what these cases show us is that one of the primary ET agendas is, in fact, to heal humanity. Now, some people feel they're being used kind of like guinea pigs and just operated on. Some feel like the ETs are their friends. And what we see is sort of a bell curve where there are good ETs and ETs who are perhaps not as good. But what we don't see is like sadism or murder on the part of the ETs. So I think it would be easier to prove that ETs are benevolent than it would be to prove that humans are. And I can tell you without a doubt that some ETs are friendly and are healing humans, and that one of the major ET agendas is to heal humans. So that's basically my presentation. I want to thank you. And yeah, if you guys got any questions, I'd love to hear them.
Thank you, Preston. That was very, very interesting. And you've done a lot of research. Very interesting about the Danish case. Perhaps after we're finished, you could write his name and I can try research who it is. I hadn't heard of this case before. Everyone can come with questions now, and Preston will answer as many as we have time for. I'll just begin. So if you guys just write in the chat if you want to chime in with a question. I'm gonna ask you about Travis Walton. This is also a very famous case. Have you had a chance to speak with Travis Walton about his healing on board when he was taken for 6 days?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I've been at conventions with him. I was on the radio once with him as well. We didn't get to discuss his actual healing, but we did discuss his encounter. Yeah, Travis Walton was struck by a beam of light from a UFO and pulled on board, which was practically witnessed by his fellow coworkers. Not quite. They drove away when it happened, but one of them did see the UFO darting away. And he was missing for 5 days and was returned, thankfully. And because at that time, his coworkers were being accused of murdering him, which clearly did not happen. And Travis Walton described a fairly typical encounter where he was examined by gray-type ETs. He also saw human-looking ETs. He was taken aboard a mothership where he saw smaller craft on board. And he actually thought he was in a hospital when he first woke up on board the UFO. This is something I've heard from a number of people. And it again shows this very strong medical theme. And Travis now believes that he had probably gotten too close to this UFO and this beam of energy struck him by accident, sort of like an electrical discharge from the UFO, damaging him very badly, maybe even killing him, and that the ETs basically healed him. So he takes a very benevolent viewpoint towards his encounter, and I tend to believe in him. I don't think ETs are intending to scare people or hurt them. I don't think that's their agenda at all, even though, you know, some people do have very frightening encounters. And the Travis Walton encounter is a good example of, you know, someone who has had a very frightening encounter, which turned out, you know, not to have evil intent. They were actually apparently healing him.
Okay. Astrid is going to come in. She has a question for you.
Yeah, hello, Preston. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, hello. I was wondering about that lady. Was it a congresswoman or who suffered from Hodgkin's disease, a kind of cancer, and who was taken on board on a UFO? Do you have any explanation of why people healed from cancers are going through this very painful operations? I mean, are there any stories of aliens who have some kind of, I don't know what you call it, anesthesia or painkillers that they can use to before the operation? Why does it have to be so painful? Do you have any idea of that?
Yeah, these are great questions. Lynn Plaskett, who was cured of Hodgkin's lymphoma, was a councilwoman. She was at the city level, a municipal councilwoman. So she wasn't a congressperson or a representative in terms of, you know, a senator or anything like that. But she is a government official who did report a healing. She was not re-elected, probably as a result of going public with her encounter. And her operation wasn't painful. But what I have found is with the cancer cases in particular, people do report painful operations. This happened to Lycia Davidson, a Los Angeles-based abductee who had full body cancer and said, yes, her operation was very painful. And I'm not sure why this is the case, other than it's a very extensive operation that has to be performed rather than, you know, something that's a simpler case of involving perhaps a single instrument. These operations are pretty extensive and also long. I mean, it takes some time to get them done. There are a lot of cases. The Betty Hill case is a good example, where she was being injected in her abdomen and it was causing her all kinds of pain. And the ET was surprised and put his hand on her forehead and relieved her pain, and sort of through mentally. There's a lot of cases like that, yeah, where ETs do realize that the person is in pain and stop the pain from occurring. And I think that's probably true in a number of these healing cases. But for some reason, yeah, people have reported that the cancer operation was painful, but they were still grateful and said that the human operations had been much worse, actually. So
Okay.
it's sort of an enigma there.
We have a question from Sim. He'll be joining us now.
Hi, Preston.
Hi, Sam.
How you doing? And thank you for taking time talking to us.
Hey, my pleasure.
Yeah. Well, my question goes about the profile of the alien, of the UFO healing people. I mean, did you, in your research, could you see or find out which of the ETs were the most who healed people, or because people report different races and different aliens?
Right. I found 4 main categories, and it was actually really surprising. I expected the largest category to be human-like ETs, but it wasn't. Most of the healings are being done by gray-type ETs or some variation of the grays. And I have to say, in my research, when someone says, I've had contact with ETs, most of the people I've talked to describe grays. So that does sort of make sense. But second to that, are human-looking ETs. Sometimes they're called Nordic. I don't like that phrase because that implies, fair-skinned, and that's not always the case. I talked to a gentleman who had an encounter with human-looking ET who he described as looking Middle Eastern. Another gentleman I talked to said, no, they looked Peruvian or maybe Mexican. So human-looking ETs do the second most numerous healings. Beyond that, it's praying mantis type, but sort of a grasshopper or praying mantis, usually described as around 9 feet tall, but sometimes taller. And after that, there's sort of a catch-all category of humanoids, which are very hard to just, they're unique. One lady, she was cured of hypoglycemia, and she said the figure that cured her was 9 feet tall, had a huge chin, a huge forehead, orange straw-like hair, was wearing a black cape, but was otherwise human-looking. Clearly not human.
Yeah.
But so, yeah, I mean, there's even a few cases involving what appear to be robotic, or maybe a couple involving reptilian, but very, very few. So mostly grays, and a lot involving just UFOs, no humanoids at all.
Just from the beam.
Right.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. Steve, I'm going to ask a question for Steve. He says, you didn't give any examples of psychiatric, psychic healings or disorders that were healed.
Oh, all right. Well, I mean, I did give examples of people who were healed through mind power, but like a good case of like someone was healed of suicide. I've got a couple of cases like this. One involves a gentleman who was suffering from suicidal depression and had actually driven out to the California desert with a gun and was planning to end his life, and held up the gun to his head and cocked the trigger. He was ready to shoot himself when a gray alien appeared in front of him. And at that point, he says all feelings of depression just left him. He had a long period of missing time, about 6 hours, and woke up. And following that, he no longer suffered from suicidal depression. There's another gentleman I interviewed who was having health problems. He had body pains. He was coughing up blood. He was very depressed. His relationship with his girlfriend was ending, and he was becoming suicidal when this UFO appeared and struck him with this beam of light. This is in Covina, California. His name is David Perez, and he says it really scared him because when the beam struck him, everything around him turned bright red, and he thought it was affecting his vision. And he drove off, and this UFO actually followed him for several miles and hovered over his car. And he got this feeling of real amazing peace, and like this thing was actually looking out for him or caring for him in some way. And following that incident, his health problems immediately cleared up. He started having premonitions. He became deeply spiritual, and his feelings of suicidal depression left him.
That's amazing.
Yeah, there are other cases like that. Many people have been taken, and they say that they feel like their intelligence has been improved. And some of these people have actually gone and taken IQ tests which they had taken before the incident, and following the incident, their IQ level has gone up like 20, 30, 40 points. So they improve people mentally in a number of different ways.
That sounds amazing. We have one last question because we are running out of time now. Astrid is just going to come back and ask you a question, and then I'll just come in at the end.
Okay. Preston, do you have any statistics on how many of those people being healed believed in UFOs, or how many didn't believe in UFOs?
Not super precise, but about 1/3 of the cases involve people who have no history of UFO encounters, and some of them were skeptical of UFOs or didn't believe in them or had never really thought about them. So while most of the cases of people who are healed involve people who are, I found 3 main categories. If you have a history of UFO encounters, that definitely increases your chances of being healed. If you're friends with a contactee or an abductee or a family member, or even work with them, that also increases your chances. If you do good work for humanity in some regard, that increases your chances. If you live in a UFO hotspot, that's another factor. But anybody can be healed. It's evenly divided between men and women. There are very elderly people who've been healed, very young people who've been healed. In terms of prior belief in UFOs, I didn't really find any patterns there. It occurs to people who don't believe in UFOs and people who do. But generally speaking, most of them occur to people who do have a history of encounters. So they already do believe.
Thank you.
Okay. On behalf of our group, I really want to thank you for doing this, and I will after share 2 stories with you about 2 cases that you don't know, one from Norway and one from Denmark. But thank you very much for sharing all your information, and it's most valuable that someone's collecting these positive stories about the healings. Thank you very much.
Hey, thank you for the opportunity. I really appreciate it.